Let us embark on a journey through time, slipping quietly into the golden shadows of ancient Egypt. Imagine for a moment, a world ruled not just by kings, but by living gods. In the heat of dawn, as sunlight glints off alabaster walls and sandstone pillars, a pharaoh, cloaked in divine symbolism, rises from silk-covered bedsheets in his vast palace. His day begins, not as a man's might, but as a god's must. In this towering, marble-floored palace nestled in the heart of Thebes, the royal compound stirs. Before the pharaoh opens his eyes, attendants tiptoe through perfumed corridors, balancing trays laden with fruits, honeyed pastries, and cool pomegranate juice. The air is thick with incense, frankincense and myrrh curling like spectral fingers along the ceiling. Blind harpists gently strum melodies meant to awaken the sun god Ra himself. Their haunting notes weaving with birdsong and the distant trickle of garden fountains. The pharaoh rises slowly, surrounded by a cadre of loyal body servants. They've already begun preparing him for the day with meticulous devotion. His skin, shaven smooth of any impurity, is massaged with sacred oils said to ward off evil spirits. Kohl lines his eyes, not merely for beauty, but for protection, both from the searing desert sun and from unseen forces. Scented oils infused with blue lotus and cinnamon glisten on his limbs. A circlet of gold rests atop his brow, gleaming with lapis lazuli and shaped like a falcon. Horus, god of the sky, ever watching. This is no mere mortal. This is Horus on earth, and his appearance must reflect that divine truth. Adorned in linen so fine it's nearly translucent, layered with sashes embroidered with sacred hieroglyphs, the pharaoh accepts his regalia with solemn grace. A priest bows low and presents the crook and flail, symbols of leadership and dominion. One to shepherd, the other to discipline. These aren't just tools of state. They're cosmic instruments meant to maintain the delicate balance between order and chaos. Each gesture, each breath, is ritual. His first task? Communion with the gods. The palace shrine is a sanctum filled with votive offerings, bronze idols, and sacred fire. As high priest of every temple in the land, the pharaoh must lead ceremonies that ensure Ma'at, the divine order, remains unbroken. He bows before Osiris, master of the underworld, pours milk and wine for Hathor, and utters invocations to the sun god Re, his divine father. The rituals are precise. Every word, every motion, calibrated. One misstep could threaten the kingdom. The spells he chants have been preserved for centuries, etched into pyramid walls and tomb ceilings like scripts for the soul. These are more than ceremonies. They are cosmic responsibilities, and failure is not an option. From there, he moves to affairs of state. The great hall echoes with the voices of scribes and advisors. Seated upon a gilded throne carved with images of divine victories, the pharaoh listens as his viziers relay the issues of the realm. Border conflicts with Nubian chieftains, tensions with the Hittites, rumors from distant Babylon. His advisors murmur, kneel, and rise again, reading scrolls with trembling fingers. He responds not merely with wisdom, but with judgment said to be divinely inspired. His word is law, not metaphorically, but literally. When he speaks, statues are carved, temples are erected, and men live or die. Yet this power carries its own curse. Beneath the golden surface lies an undercurrent of constant pressure. Every moment of the pharaoh's life is performed, observed, and judged, not just by mortals, but by the gods themselves. He must embody perfection. One falter, one sign of weakness, and the divine favor could vanish like mist over the Nile. After administrative duties come public appearances. Parades of grandeur unfold in the streets of Thebes. The pharaoh rides in a chariot of gold and cedar, plumes of ostrich feathers fanning from his headdress. Citizens cheer, throw flowers, and prostrate themselves. Children are lifted to glimpse their god-king. Women sing hymns. Elders weep in reverence. And yet, even in these triumphal displays, there are rules. So many rules. He must enter buildings right foot first. He must never let his shadow cross a sacred flame or fall upon a priest. Meals must be eaten with the left hand only. The right is reserved for the divine. These superstitions aren't just personal quirks, they are protocol. Fail to observe them, and calamity might strike. As the sun lowers into a haze of ochre and crimson, the pharaoh retreats to private quarters. The scent of sandalwood fills the evening air. Dancing girls perform slow, sinuous movements accompanied by soft harp chords. The pharaoh, reclined on cushions, sips date wine from an embossed goblet. But he doesn't smile. Not really. Even in this moment of apparent leisure, his mind is elsewhere, caught between the physical realm and the eternal. His body may be here, but his soul is preparing for something far more important. For everything the pharaoh does in life is in service of the afterlife. He is building a tomb, a palace of death, a sacred complex hidden away in the Valley of the Kings, filled with treasure, spells, and symbolic architecture. It will serve as both his fortress and vessel as he journeys through the perils of Duat, the underworld. All must be ready. Every trap, every chamber, every painted wall, a guidepost for his soul. And so ends another day in the life of a pharaoh. Half man, half god, trapped in ritual, surrounded by gold, driven by fear. For while his subjects see glory, he sees responsibility. While the world bows before him, he bows before the heavens. Tomorrow it will all begin again. With the break of dawn, the Pharaoh's divine obligations resumed as predictably as the rising of the sun god Ra. Before engaging in matters of war or governance, he first submitted himself to purification. In a chamber adorned with alabaster basins and lotus-tiled floors, the sacred cleansing ritual began. Priests, clad in pristine white linen, approached with vessels of holy water drawn from the Nile at dawn. Some days he would bathe himself in a consecrated pool. Other times, the priest would pour water over his body in rhythmic waves, chanting prayers to banish any spiritual blemish that might have clung to him overnight. This wasn't just hygiene. It was metaphysical maintenance. The body of the pharaoh was considered a vessel for divine energy, and even the faintest trace of impurity could threaten Egypt's cosmic stability. Every bead of water that touched his flesh carried symbolic weight, a baptism that reinforced his bond to the heavens. Once cleansed, the dressing ritual commenced. Fine linen robes, sheer and expertly woven, were draped across his form. These were no ordinary garments. They shimmered with subtle threads of gold and were embroidered with sacred symbols: ankhs, scarabs, solar discs. One robe might depict Horus spreading his wings across the chest, another, the coiled cobra of Wajet, guardian of kings. Then came the regalia, the double crown of Upper and Lower Egypt, representing unity, the scepter, symbol of dominion, the crook and flail, marking him as both shepherd and punisher of his people. Each item was more than decoration. It was a declaration of cosmic responsibility. When the pharaoh wore these sacred symbols, he became the fulcrum of order in a universe forever teetering on the edge of chaos. Even the seemingly mundane details, how he stepped out of the dressing chamber, the direction he turned, the hand with which he took his morning meal, were dictated by ancient protocol. To stray from these patterns, no matter how small the error, was believed to endanger Egypt's equilibrium. The gods, ever watchful, would notice. Once fully adorned, the pharaoh emerged from the inner sanctum to begin his daily public duties. His first stop, the temple. Towering colonnades, flickering braziers, and lotus-filled pools framed his path as he made his way into the sacred sanctuary. As high priest of every temple across the land, it was his sacred burden to personally offer devotions. The people rarely saw him this close. When they did, many would fall to their knees in silent awe. Inside, the air was thick with incense and reverence. Sacred statues, some plated in gold, others carved from black basalt, stood at attention. The pharaoh approached, bearing offerings: bowls of honey, bread shaped like the sun, jars of fragrant oils. He recited spells passed down through generations, words believed to hold the very structure of creation in their syllables. Each offering was placed with exacting precision. A misstep, a stutter, even a wayward breath could be interpreted as a breach in the divine covenant. It was exhausting, but it was necessary. These rituals weren't just for show. They were the spiritual fuel that kept the Nile flowing, the crops growing, and the enemies at bay. After this sacred communion, the pharaoh shifted from divine priest to earthly sovereign. Seated upon a golden throne shaped like a lion, flanked by lotus and papyrus motifs, he presided over meetings with his viziers, trusted stewards who functioned as the pharaoh's eyes and ears across the two lands. With scrolls unfurled and voices hushed, they brought news from the frontiers: border tensions with the Nubians, uneasy trade agreements with the Hittites, rumors of rebellion along the delta. He would listen intently, sometimes nodding, sometimes interrupting. Though the viziers administered the machinery of state, the pharaoh's judgment was final. His voice could spare or sentence. In many cases, his decisions were rooted not only in policy, but also in ma'at, the moral and spiritual code that demanded harmony, balance, and justice. Petitioners from across the kingdom also came before him: peasants who had disputes over land, merchants who sought restitution for theft, artisans who asked for exemptions during temple construction. The pharaoh heard each with solemn care. Even the smallest matter carried spiritual consequences. If he ruled unjustly, the gods might punish Egypt with famine or flood. But with absolute power came dangerous temptations. Without any legal limits, a pharaoh could easily slip into tyranny. Some raised taxes beyond reason to fund their obsessions with grandeur. Others turned paranoid, suspecting their closest kin of betrayal and purging entire branches of their family. One notorious ruler, driven by fear, executed both his mother and brother, silencing any claim to the throne but his own. And yet, the day was not solely consumed by weighty decisions and divine rites. There were also moments of theater and indulgence. The pharaoh might join a ceremonial lion hunt, barreling through desert plains in a chariot gilded with electrum, loosing arrows with ritual precision. These displays weren't merely sport. They were symbolic acts of domination over chaos, a performance of cosmic strength. Each slain predator was a metaphor. Disorder vanquished, the natural world subdued. Or perhaps, after such exertion, he'd retreat indoors for a quieter pleasure, a game of sonnet. The painted board, set with ornate squares and carved pieces, was more than entertainment. To the Egyptians, Senet was a sacred contest between order and chaos, fate and cunning. Its final squares represented the gates to the afterlife. Every move whispered of eternity. As the sun descended into the western sky and temples cast long shadows across the city, the pharaoh would retire once more. But even in rest, his duties were not forgotten. Nightfall didn't free him. It simply shifted his realm from public service to spiritual vigilance. He might consult with temple astronomers about omens in the stars, or scribes who interpreted dreams. He might receive acolytes to anoint him for sleep, wrapping his limbs in linen charms. For in the hours of darkness, when the soul was said to journey through the duat, the underworld, he must still perform as king. Sleep, then, was never surrender. It was another duty, another ritual. And in the hush of his chamber, surrounded by incense and silence, the pharaoh would close his eyes. Not in weakness, but in sacred preparation for the next day's trial. Even in his moments of rest, the pharaoh was never truly free from his divine obligations. As dusk fell over the land and the air cooled with the coming of night, the great king retreated into his opulent quarters. Polished alabaster lamps glowed softly along colonnaded halls, and harpists played slow, haunting melodies. Scented oils diffused through the air, lotus, myrrh, and cinnamon, meant to soothe both body and soul. But for the pharaoh, sleep was not simply a luxury, it was a passage. According to ancient belief, when the pharaoh drifted into slumber, his ba, the spiritual component of his soul, would rise from his body and ascend to the realm of the gods. There, he would commune with deities, receive messages, and even face judgment. Sleep was seen as a sacred state, a liminal space between the seen and unseen. And like all aspects of his life, even rest was governed by ritual. Before bed, protective spells were spoken. Charms were tucked beneath pillows. Incantations were etched into the wooden frame of his bed. These weren't superstitions. They were insurance. In the dream world, malevolent forces roamed freely. If unguarded, the pharaoh's soul could be harmed, misled, or even lost. Dream interpreters, highly respected members of court, would be consulted the next morning to analyze any visions. A lion could mean triumph, a crocodile, betrayal, a missing tooth, illness. Some pharaohs took these dreams so seriously that they altered policy or accelerated temple construction in response. Ramses II, for example, once dreamed of the god Ptah scolding him for a half-finished temple. He awoke disturbed and immediately ordered the work resumed with double labor. Even asleep, the king's mind was never far from his divine duties. And that weight of kingship, of symbolism, of cosmic balance was inescapable. To be pharaoh meant living inside a never-ending performance. From waking to sleeping, from breath to burial, every action was infused with divine consequence. One misstep, one forgotten phrase during a ritual, and the entire equilibrium of Egypt might tip toward disorder. The Nile might not flood, crops might fail, enemies might invade. The line between natural disaster and spiritual error was razor thin. Still, amid these pressures, there were moments of splendor. During his waking hours, the pharaoh indulged in grand ceremonial hunts, thundering across the desert in a chariot, loosing arrows into lions or antelope. These excursions were more than sport. They were symbolic reenactments of the eternal battle against chaos. The wild beast represented Isfet, disorder, darkness. Each successful strike reaffirmed the pharaoh's divine strength and the supremacy of Ma'at. After such triumphs, the king might retire beneath a pavilion for a midday meal. Grapes, figs, roast goose, and honeyed bread were served on polished silver trays. Courtiers fanned him with palm fronds, while musicians played flutes and lyres. And yet, even in leisure, the shadow of his role loomed. Conversations drifted back to temple affairs, succession planning, or regional diplomacy. In the palace garden, he might walk beside pools filled with sacred fish, pondering the construction of a new obelisk or the expansion of a shrine to Hathor. Every project bore his cartouche. Every wall, every statue, every inscription was a cry across time. I was here. I ruled. I mattered. This obsession with legacy defined every pharaoh. Their reign was not confined to life, but extended deep into death. Preparations for the afterlife began from the moment of coronation. Tomb construction was constant. Architects worked for decades, designing multi-chambered necropolises hidden within cliffs and sands. Every inch was inscribed with texts meant to guide the soul through the duat. The Egyptian underworld, spells, maps, talismans, all were part of the journey. It wasn't enough to be great in life, one had to be eternal in death. And this desire bred some of the most extraordinary architecture the world has ever known. The pyramids, massive temples, colossal statues, all were acts of spiritual engineering. Their scale wasn't just grandeur, it was protection, legacy, immortality. The labor behind them was immense. Tens of thousands of workers, artisans, and slaves toiled beneath the sun. Some willingly, others not, all in service of ensuring their ruler could live forever. Yet, paradoxically, the pharaohs lived with the constant knowledge of death. They might be called gods, but they aged, they bled, they grew ill. Some were crippled by diseases or accidents. Scans of mummies show arthritis, fractures, malformed bones. One pharaoh, Tutankhamun, likely walked with a cane due to a clubfoot and bone necrosis. Another died in his 20s, possibly from an infected leg injury. The divine mask was always slipping, and so, behind the robes, behind the crowns, behind the reverence, they were human. Lonely, exhausted, afraid. Their grandeur was breathtaking, yes, but so too was their burden. They lived not just for themselves, but for millions. Not just in the present, but in eternity. Every sunrise was a reckoning, every decree, a sacred act, every mistake, a possible curse. And so, as they lay down each night, wrapped in fine linens, guarded by statues, cushioned on beds of cedar, they prayed. Not just for dreams, but for mercy. But even in death, the legacy of the pharaohs did not vanish. It evolved. Centuries after the Old and Middle Kingdoms rose and fell, after Nubian and Assyrian invasions, after the sands reclaimed tombs and temples alike, a new force swept into Egypt, one that would reshape its destiny forever. Alexander the Great. In 332 BCE, Alexander marched into Egypt and was hailed not as a conqueror, but as a liberator from Persian rule. The Egyptians crowned him pharaoh in Memphis, and just like that, a new chapter began. Though Macedonian by birth, Alexander embraced Egyptian traditions. He paid homage at sacred temples, offered sacrifices, and even claimed divine descent from Amun-Ra. But before he could fully establish his reign, he died suddenly in Babylon at the age of 32. From the ashes of his empire emerged one of his generals, Ptolemy I Soter, who seized Egypt and declared himself pharaoh. Thus began the Ptolemaic dynasty, a curious fusion of Greek intellect and Egyptian ritual that would last for nearly 3 centuries. The Ptolemies ruled from Alexandria, a coastal city founded by Alexander himself. There, beneath marble colonnades and Greco-Egyptian sphinxes, the old and new collided. The Ptolemaic pharaohs adapted many Egyptian customs to legitimize their rule. They married their siblings, styled themselves as gods, and participated in elaborate temple rituals. But they also retained strong Greek influences, naming their children in Greek, inviting Hellenistic scholars into their courts, and commissioning structures that blended Doric columns with hieroglyphic walls. Among the Ptolemies' grandest achievements was the Lighthouse of Pharaohs, an architectural marvel that stood over 330 feet tall. This tower guided ships safely into Alexandria's harbor and symbolized the dynasty's ambition to bridge worlds, light guiding through darkness, Greek ingenuity illuminating ancient Egyptian tradition. Yet for all their splendor, the Ptolemies were not immune to the darker undercurrents of power. Intrigue haunted the palace halls. Family members turned against one another in deadly succession struggles. Queens plotted in shadows, advisors whispered poison-laced words, and among these stories, one name rises above all others: Cleopatra VII, the last pharaoh of Egypt. Cleopatra was no mere seductress. Fluent in multiple languages, she was a scholar, strategist, and survivor. She positioned herself at the heart of Rome's civil wars, aligning first with Julius Caesar and then with Mark Antony. Her aim, to preserve Egypt's independence and elevate her dynasty. But the tides turned at Actium, and when Antony fell in battle, Cleopatra chose to follow him in death, allegedly by the bite of a sacred asp. With her passing in 30 BCE, the Ptolemaic line ended. Rome annexed Egypt, and the era of god-kings came to a close. But Cleopatra's story didn't fade. It flourished, becoming legend, myth, a cautionary tale, and enduring symbol all at once. What the Ptolemies lacked in longevity, they compensated for in influence. They were patrons of the famed Library of Alexandria, a repository of global knowledge unmatched in the ancient world. It was here that Egyptian priests like Manetho penned the first chronological histories of the pharaohs, dividing them into 30 dynasties, a structure still used today by modern Egyptologists. And it was during this same period that a peculiar document known as the Dream Book was created, a papyrus listing nearly 200 different dreams and their meanings. Dreaming of eating figs, prosperity ahead. Dreaming of being burned alive, doom awaits. It was a glimpse into a culture that saw no divide between waking and sleeping, between the mundane and the mystical. In many ways, the Ptolemies were Egypt's final echo. Their reign marked both the continuation and the end of a sacred tradition. They upheld the rituals, built the temples, and styled themselves in the image of Ra and Horus. But their rule was increasingly performative, a theater of gods, played out before Roman senators and foreign diplomats. They had the titles, they wore the crowns, but the world was changing, and Egypt, once the beating heart of a continent-spanning civilization, was no longer the center of the world. Still, in the twilight of the pharaohs, something enduring remained. Even as Rome tightened its grip and new emperors declared their own divinity, the memory of the Egyptian god-kings lingered like incense in an empty temple. The colossal statues, the pyramids that pierced the sky, the hieroglyphs etched into eternity, all spoke of a time when humans lived alongside gods. And it is in this enduring myth that the pharaohs truly triumphed. For while their bodies may lie still beneath stone, their names are spoken still. Their stories are studied, their monuments admired, their rituals reenacted in the minds of dreamers and scholars alike. They are no longer rulers of land or army, but they are emperors of memory, eternal. The journey to the afterlife was never simple. For the pharaohs of Egypt, death marked not the end, but the beginning of their most perilous and consequential voyage. Their entire reign, every ritual, every law, every monument, was, in some way, preparation for this transition. And for all their public grandeur, it was in death that their deepest fears and wildest hopes came into focus. They believed that to enter the field of reeds, the blessed paradise of the dead, one had to pass a series of trials in the duat, or underworld. This realm, governed by terrifying deities and populated with monstrous beasts, was both psychological and physical, a place of judgment and transformation. To navigate it successfully, the pharaoh required spells, amulets, and above all, the favor of the gods. And so, they built their tombs as portals, meticulously designed passageways between the worlds of the living and the divine. Tomb walls were inscribed with the Book of the Dead, a manual of survival. Magic spells were chanted to disarm demons. Paintings depicted the weighing of the heart against the feather of Ma'at, an ordeal that would determine one's soul's fate. If the heart was lighter, paradise awaited. If heavier with sin, the soul would be devoured by a monstrous hybrid known as Ammit. These fears were not abstract. They shaped reality. Some pharaohs went so far as to be buried with dozens, even hundreds, of human servants, slain or sacrificed, to accompany and serve them in the afterlife. These individuals were believed to carry their loyalty into eternity, ensuring their king never lacked for comfort. It's a chilling testament to just how deeply ingrained the concept of divine entitlement was. Death, for a pharaoh, demanded no less grandeur than life. But not all rulers embraced such grim practices. Akhenaten, a revolutionary figure, broke from centuries of tradition during his reign in the 14th century BCE. He outlawed the worship of Egypt's traditional gods and instead promoted Aten, the sun disk, as the sole deity. He moved the capital to a new city, Marna, and constructed temples flooded with sunlight open to the sky. The change was more than theological. It was architectural, cultural, and profoundly personal. His tomb, unlike those of his predecessors, showed no signs of mass sacrifice, no subsidiary graves of servants, just the king, alone with his god of light. It may have been an attempt to purge the darker aspects of Egypt's funerary traditions, to reflect a new spiritual vision, one more aligned with individual judgment than cosmic hierarchy. Yet, Akhenaten's revolution did not last. After his death, his son, Tutankhamun, restored the old gods and returned to Thebes. The worship of Amun, Osiris, and Horus resumed. Temples that had been defaced were repaired. Statues of Aten were toppled. Akhenaten's memory was condemned, his name erased from monuments, his city left to decay. And so, Egypt, once again, returned to the elaborate rituals of the past. Tutankhamun's own tomb, unearthed in 1922 by Howard Carter, remains one of the most iconic archaeological discoveries of all time. Inside were golden shrines, chariots, weapons, perfume jars, board games, and the mummified remains of his stillborn daughters. Though these children weren't victims of ritual killing, their presence in his tomb suggests that even in this era of reform, death still required bloodlines and symbols of divine continuity. The obsession with the afterlife only intensified in later dynasties. Seti the Roer and Ramses II, pharaohs of the New Kingdom, commissioned multi-chambered tombs hidden deep in the Valley of the Kings. These underground complexes were vast and labyrinthine, decorated from floor to ceiling with spells, guardians, and celestial maps. They featured false doors and decoy chambers to confuse tomb robbers. Sacred boats, food stores, and animal effigies lined the corridors. These weren't just burial sites. They were sanctuaries, battle plans, and palaces rolled into one. Their goal? To preserve the pharaoh's soul long enough to reach divine reunion. Even the servants evolved. Instead of living humans, later tombs included Shabti figurines, small statuettes designed to magically spring to life in the afterlife and perform labor on behalf of the deceased. Made of faience, wood, or stone, these eerie little figures bore inscriptions detailing their duties, ready to serve without complaint. Such innovations reflected both pragmatism and paranoia. Tomb robbing was rampant. Many tombs were plundered within decades, if not years, of their sealing. Some pharaohs resorted to secrecy and architectural misdirection. Others trusted in elaborate curses or guardianship by temple priests. But in the end, very few tombs escaped intrusion. The desire for gold and relics outweighed reverence. Still, the idea of the pharaoh's eternity persisted. Even as dynasties crumbled, invasions came, and gods were replaced. The tombs remained as silent testaments to an immortal dream. Long after their treasures were stripped and their names forgotten, the bones of kings whispered to the earth, "I was, I ruled, I endure." Today, we see more than gold and glitter. We see longing, fear, hope. We see men who wore crowns heavy with myth, who prepared for death more than for life. We see a civilization that poured its greatest artistry and intellect into ensuring that its leaders would never truly die. And in that strange, haunting ambition, one born of sand, sun, and spirit, we are left with perhaps the greatest monument of all: memory. Few pharaohs encapsulate the duality of glory and obsession quite like Ramses II, often called Ramses the Great. Ascending to the throne around 1279 BCE, Ramses ruled for an astonishing 66 years, one of the longest reigns in all of Egypt's recorded history. His time on the throne marked a period of immense prosperity, stunning artistic output, and imperial ambition. But behind the magnificence of monuments and myth lay a portrait of a man driven as much by ego as by divine mandate. He embarked on one of the most aggressive construction programs in Egyptian history. Temples, tombs, and colossal statues were erected from Abu Simbel in the south to Pyrameses in the Nile Delta. These structures didn't just honor the gods, they elevated Ramses to their level. Statues over 80 feet tall depicted him with the calm smile of eternity, eyes gazing down as if already surveying the heavens. Walls bore inscriptions of his victories, some exaggerated, others entirely invented, meant to rewrite history in his favor. His battle at Kadesh against the Hittites, for example, was portrayed as a resounding personal triumph, though records suggest it was, at best, a stalemate. Nevertheless, reliefs across temple walls show him charging into battle alone, surrounded by vanquished foes, arrows raining from the sky. To see these images was to be reminded that Ramses was not merely a king, but a living god, chosen by the divine to rule and protect the two lands. And as if the structures weren't enough, he carved his name over the works of predecessors, erasing theirs in a brazen act of legacy theft. Temples once dedicated to lesser-known pharaohs were repurposed, rebranded as monuments to Ramses. His goal was clear: to dominate both time and space. But Ramses didn't stop at architecture. His personal life was equally colossal. He fathered over 100 children, with an extensive array of wives and concubines. His principal queen, Nefertari, held a unique position of power and affection, immortalized in her elaborately adorned tomb in the Valley of the Queens. Yet Ramses' harem was sprawling, a symbol not only of desire, but of status and fecundity. Fertility equaled divine favor. The more sons he sired, the more eternal his bloodline appeared. Ramses even named several of his sons and grandsons after himself, an effort to embed his identity into Egypt's very future. Yet for all his efforts, few of these descendants lived up to his titanic shadow. His eventual successor, Merneptah, came to power as an old man and ruled for only a decade. But perhaps the most haunting example of Ramses' obsession with eternity lies in his funerary complex, the Ramesseum. Located on the west bank of the Nile near Luxor, the Ramesseum was more than a temple. It was a propaganda machine in stone. Its towering pylons and endless corridors of hieroglyphs proclaimed the glory of Ramses to generations unborn. It was served by its own administrative town, with priests, scribes, and laborers dedicated solely to maintaining rituals for the dead king's ka, his vital essence. His mummy, when discovered centuries later, revealed a man in his 90s, with signs of arthritis and dental decay. Time had not spared his body, but his legend endured. The great king who once stood as tall as the gods now lay wrapped in linen, face hollow, jaw agape, as if eternally shouting across the void. Even his burial mask, though less famous than Tutankhamun's, was a masterpiece of design, intended not just to protect his spirit, but to declare his identity in the afterlife with radiant certainty. I am Ramses, it seemed to say. I was a god. I remain. Yet, behind the golden grandeur was a deeper fear, the fear of being forgotten. Ramses' overwhelming drive to build, name, sire, and rule stemmed from the same dread that haunts all men, oblivion. For all his might, he could not conquer time, and so he tried to outbuild it. In doing so, he became both monument and warning, a symbol of how power, unchecked, can create splendor and distortion in equal measure. His monuments endure, yes, but so do the shadows they cast. Ramses' legacy is complex, part awe, part unease. He ruled as a living god, yet died a fragile man. He shaped history, but he also tried to rewrite it. His story is one of triumph and illusion, devotion and delusion. And in the end, he reminds us of a truth as old as the Nile itself. No matter how tall the statue, how vast the tomb, or how many names are etched into stone, time erodes all. What remains is not just the king, but the question he leaves behind. What does it truly mean to live forever? Even now, centuries after their tombs were sealed and their dynasties faded into sand and shadow, the pharaohs continue to speak, not through voices, but through stone, through monuments that refuse to crumble, through names that echo across time. They built not merely for function, but for forever. Every column, every glyph, every colossal statue carved into mountainsides served as both declaration and defiance, a refusal to be forgotten. Eternity was not only a theological promise, but an architectural endeavor. They believed that to last, one must be remembered, and so they built with permanence in mind. And in many ways, it worked. From the Great Pyramid at Giza to the sprawling temples of Karnak and Luxor, these structures remain among the most awe-inspiring ever constructed. Even now, As tourists wander through their ruins and scholars argue over translations, the spirit of the pharaohs lingers. We may not speak their tongue, but we understand what they were trying to say. They were men and women who wielded powers beyond imagining. They commanded armies, redrew borders, and spoke as intermediaries with the gods. They demanded and received offerings, reverence, fear. But they also loved, mourned, aged, and eventually died, just like us. And that is the paradox that makes them so compelling. They were both gods and people, myth and flesh, carved into legend, yet rooted in all too human flaws and desires. They starved for legacy, feared irrelevance, and strove for eternity with a desperation we still recognize today. Their afterlife wasn't just a spiritual destination, it was a public goal, a cultural obsession. Every servant laid in a tomb, every jewel-studded mask, every grain-filled jar was part of a larger declaration. I will not disappear. I will not be reduced to dust and silence. But time, as always, had other plans. Tombs were looted, names were chiseled away, dynasties collapsed, foreign rulers came and went, whole cities were swallowed by the desert or buried beneath new empires, and yet, the memory remained. In museum galleries lit by artificial lights, behind glass cases and velvet ropes, their treasures still glint. Sarcophagi still bear the outlines of faces once called divine. The smell of resin, faint and ancient, clings to linen wrappings. And amid all this, their stories unfold once more. To say their plan succeeded would not be an exaggeration. No civilization in human history has been so fixated upon, so excavated, so mythologized. The pharaohs may no longer rule a kingdom, but they command our fascination. They are invoked in literature, cinema, even advertising. Their likenesses adorn books, coins, and classroom walls. They have, in a very real sense, become immortal. Yet there's something more intimate beneath the grandeur. We marvel at their treasures, yes, but we also search their faces. We examine their CT scans. We read their love poems and try to decipher their dreams. We look past the gold and into their bones, hunting for what they were truly like. Because deep down, we are not just seeking history. We are seeking kinship. What did it feel like to carry the burden of being divine? To know the world believed your touch could heal or curse? Did they ever wish to be ordinary? Did they laugh freely? Did they sleep well? Did they wonder, as we do, what might come after? These are not questions stones can answer, but perhaps their silence is part of the point. Perhaps in the end, the pharaohs teach us that greatness is not in escaping death, but in facing it fully, by leaving behind a life that still moves others, even long after the last heartbeat fades. And so we remember them, not only for their crowns and curses, but for their courage to try, to build, to believe, to endure. And maybe that's why we continue to tell their stories, generation after generation. Not just to honor them, but to remind ourselves that our own lives, too, can echo beyond their end. That we, like them, are made of both stardust and story. Resurrected in our books and museum halls, the pharaohs live on, not as dusty relics, but as enduring presences woven into the very fabric of human memory. We still speak their names: Khufu, Nefertiti, Hatshepsut, Tutankhamun, Ramses, Cleopatra. We stand in awe before their monuments, their mummies, their myths. They built for eternity, and in a sense, they achieved it. Though perhaps not in the way they imagined. For them, immortality was a right bestowed by divinity, reinforced by ritual. The pharaoh was meant to live forever, first as a god on earth, and then as a god among the stars. His body preserved, his name carved in stone, his ka nourished by prayers and offerings. For ordinary Egyptians, the path was less assured. The afterlife had to be earned, through righteousness, service, and careful preparation. This contrast, this yawning chasm between the divine and the mortal, is part of what makes the world of ancient Egypt feel at once luminous and alien. It was a civilization where a single human could move rivers, reroute gods, and reshape the landscape of time, simply by being born royal. That was the weight and privilege of being pharaoh, to bear both the light of heaven and the shadow of limitless power. And yet, for all their grandeur, the pharaohs were never immune to the flaws of flesh. They limped, they ached, they wept, they raged. They suffered the betrayals of kin and the indignities of age. Many lived surrounded by danger, poisoned by fear, or corrupted by ambition. They were rulers, yes, but they were also sons, daughters, spouses, and siblings. They knew joy, grief, ecstasy, and terror. They were, in the most human sense, profoundly alive. And that, perhaps more than any pyramid or tomb, is their true legacy. That even the most exalted among us are still one of us. Even a pharaoh, robed in gold, anointed with sacred oils, flanked by priests and protected by God, was still a person, still trying to understand life, still trying to outwit death, still hoping their story would matter after the final breath. The ancient Egyptians believed that to speak the name of the dead was to bring them to life again. To remember was to resurrect. Perhaps that is why we return to these stories again and again, because in telling them, we share in their afterlife. We become part of their eternity. Every time we marvel at the pyramids or gaze upon the serene face of Nefertiti's bust, or whisper the name Tutankhamun with a hush of reverence, we are keeping them alive, not in flesh, but in meaning. We are lighting the torch of their memory and passing it forward, generation to generation, across the sands of time. They built their tombs and pyramids to stand until the end of days, and in doing so, they built themselves into the bedrock of our history. The pharaohs are gone, but they are not forgotten. They live in our books, in our dreams, in our myths, as real and vivid as the paint on their tomb walls, as haunting as the echo of a priest's chant in a ruined temple. And so, we lay them to rest, not just in history, but in reverence, with wonder, with reflection, with the soft murmur of their names echoing through the corridors of our shared past. Sleep well, god kings and queens of the Nile. May your Ka endure, may your Ba take flight, and may your stories be told again and again for all time. Theirs is a saga etched in stone and soul, a story of stunning victories and staggering losses, of divine grandeur and human vulnerability. From sun-drenched temples to shadowed burial chambers, the pharaohs have left behind more than relics. They've left riddles, monuments that soar into the sky, echoing with the silence of centuries. Tombs carved deep into desert cliffs, still whispering secrets in the language of the stars. Papyri filled with prayers and spells, voices that refuse to fade. It is a story of beauty and brutality intertwined, of gold-laden sarcophagi guarding frail, mortal bones, of festivals honoring the gods even as slaves toiled in the dust, of the yearning to be remembered even as the world moved on. The pharaohs remind us that beneath even the most divine image is a human heart, beating with fear, ambition, and hope. And that reminder lingers, because the deeper we dig into the sands of ancient Egypt, the more we unearth of ourselves. Our own desire to matter, our fear of being forgotten, our need to tell stories that stretch beyond our lifetimes. It's why we still gaze at their statues in quiet awe, why we trace hieroglyphs with our eyes as though they might speak again, why we listen for the footsteps of kings long buried, half hoping to hear echoes of their once thunderous strides. And so, we arrive at the end of this long, winding journey through the lives of the pharaohs. We've stood in their palaces and knelt in their tombs. We've watched them rise as gods and fall as mortals. We've seen them love and rage, build and destroy, ascend and decay. And through it all, we've carried with us a simple truth, that even in their most divine moments, they were reflections of us, just magnified. As we close the chapter, let us not forget that these weren't just kings and queens. They were architects of meaning, shapers of time, symbols of both awe and warning. They remind us of how high we can climb and how far we can fall, how power dazzles and how legacy haunts. And now, dear listener, as your eyes grow heavy and the hush of sleep begins to settle in, let this final image linger. A desert, still and vast beneath a moonlit sky. A temple, half buried in sand. A name, chiseled in fading glyphs. And beneath it all, the slow, steady silence of history, waiting, always, to be remembered. May your dreams be guided by starlight and stories. May you walk beside the Nile in reverie. And may the peace of ancient kings watch over your sleep. Thank you for walking this path with me tonight. Until we meet again, good night.